What is up, everybody? Svenddiesel here with Sportsman's Warehouse. We're going to be tying up a surf candy. This is one of Bob's more famous patterns for the salt, and I've also had a little bit of luck on freshwater, but we're going to go ahead and get started here. We've got a Daiichi. This is a 2546 and a 2-aught. It's a pretty good size hook. It's a saltwater hook, and that's primarily where this gets fished. I'm going to go with a little bit of a heavier thread, white, because I like to color the, I guess, the mouth on these different colors. And we're going to be using bucktail for the body of this. You can use a lot of different materials for this. I've used all flash, I've used some synthetic fibers, but the bucktail is one that is just classic, and it comes in a bunch of different colors. I usually two-tone it with a white and a yellow, as we're doing here. And we're going to be tying in some Flashabou here for our lateral lines. You could also get in some wider flash, the actual lateral lines. But for the body, we're going to be using this tubing here. This is 1/8 inch. I really like the size of this. It gives a really good narrow profile, and we've got some Mirage eyes here in size to fit. And we're going to be covering this whole thing in a UV resin. We're using some Loon Thin. So there's the material list. Let's go ahead and get started with this. I primarily always tie these on saltwater hooks because usually these are fished in the surf and in the saltwater. I've had a little bit of luck on freshwater, but yeah, I mainly have these in my salt box. So let's go ahead and get started with this thread on here. We're just going to work our way down the shank of our hook here to the bend, give a nice little thread base there, and we'll go ahead and trim out our tag end. You don't need to have pretty wraps here. You notice how I spaced out those wraps to provide a little bit of gripping for that bucktail. And what we're going to do is, if you look at this bucktail, you can see this is a really good piece. This has lots of long fibers. I want kind of a little bit of a thicker body to this because we're using small clumps. Smaller is better. So I'm going to grab it by the base of the tail, not from the tip. And you can see we have a little bit of variety there. They're not all long, and that's really what I want. I want it to taper, and so I'm just going to measure this, and you can see how the bulk of these hairs end about here. And so that's about, the rest of it's going to be mainly taper, and so I'm going to measure about 1.5 times the length of the shank of the hook for the main body of this bucktail, and we'll go ahead and tie it in on the top of the shank with a couple loose wraps. And then as I work my way back, I'm pinching that bucktail on the top side of the shank so it's not flaring around. And then be careful not to really crank on this wrap right here at the back, because then it will flare. And we'll go ahead and now I work my way back up, and I'm cranking down on those wraps on this, and I'm going to do another pass just because I really want this to be a durable fly. We're going to be coating this whole thing in resin, and the resin does penetrate through the mylar or whatever this tubing is made of. And so we're going to grab a similar clump, if anything a little bit sparser, of this yellow, and I'm going to pick it out of the same area because I want the shorter fibers in there as well, and it adds a little bit more of the body into a slender taper, and that's just a personal preference of mine. And I'm just going to measure this out and see, I want the yellow to be almost a little bit longer, more of a predominant on top. And so I'm going to measure that out, and I'm just going to cut these tips if they're not perfectly aligned. Makes it a little bit easier to tie them in, and so we're not stacking these or anything like that because we want that natural taper. And so I'll double check that, and we'll go ahead and just tie that in. It doesn't matter if they match up. It's a little bit more convenient if they do, but I'd rather have the tail the correct proportion than right here, because like I said, we're covering this in that mylar tubing. You won't even see it. So I'm using real good cranking wraps, and now we're going to tie in our lateral lines. I'm using Flashabou for this. I'm just going to take about 3 strands off the core of this, maybe 4, and just keep them lined up together. I'm going to kind of measure and see, oh, this is a perfect length for this tail. I want it going almost to the tips, and I'm just going to fold them in half here around my thread, bring it down on top, and then as I wrap around, I'm pulling those the flash down to the side, and you can see right there it's going to be coming straight back now as my lateral lines. They also make some tinsel or flash that is wider, and when I do that I run it all the way up to the head. But for the purpose of this, we're tying in a pretty the pearl body is pretty flashy, and so we're going to do just a little half hitch to secure our thread here. And like I said, this is going to be covered in resin, and so it's going to be ultra durable. I'll trim out my thread. I've never found a trick to put this body tubing on while leaving my thread in without cutting the whole tubing. So if anybody has a trick, please comment below. But you can see we're going to cut this tubing roughly the length of the hook. I want to make sure I've got a little hanging out the eye, and then what I'm going to do is trim this portion off. And then I'm going to show you a little trick here, because I want some of this mylar tubing going back into the tail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my scissors and just do a little slit cut right here. And what we're doing is we're providing enough of that, a big enough cut for that to slide down around the hook bend right there. And then back it all the way on, leave some room, tie your thread back on, do real, I do about 10 to 12 wraps here just to get it nice and secure. Because this is going to be what's holding that tubing on until we get the resin. And so what we're going to do now, and here's the trick, a lot of people struggle with this. I'm going to push that tubing so it's almost flush with the eye. You can see what we're going to do is as I wrap over it, I'm going to back it up towards the tail. So here I come up around, I pinch down so I've got a little bit on the exposure side, and right now I'm kind of holding that in place, and then I'll pull it just a little bit back. And we can see I got it. That's a pretty decent one. I'd say that's like a 7 out of 10. Sometimes they go more perfect. It depends on how those end bristles. I think I actually used a new tubing. I forgot to cut the ends off. Sometimes those are a little bit more bulky, but that will actually work. If you struggle with this, if it keeps pulling out, sliding off, you can always come in and trim that mylar tubing, just tie it off and cut the butt ends. But secure your head there, and we're going to do a little trick for setting the eyes. If you've got a pair of flat needle nose, I prefer it without the grip, little slots in it. And I'm just going to come and I'm going to pinch this thread so that it basically flattens it. Makes it way easier for getting your eyes, picture perfect for those posts. And you can see right there, that is a really awesome body. It's going to be nice and slender. I want to trim a little bit more of that underside to get that flaring around the bend of the hook, and you can see right there, oh, that's money. So you want that tubing to be about straight, and then I just come in here and I pick it out just a little bit. And I do this before I resin because I want it to, I don't want the resin to dictate what stays and what goes. By doing this right here, I'm kind of tapering that mylar tubing right into the tail, and that is pretty much the fly. You could fish this as is right now, but we're going to color the head. I usually do pink, red, orange, yellow. I've tried black, but blues I haven't had good luck with. But yeah, I just want like a little hot spot. I've also put tungsten beads here before, but the weight, usually I'm fishing on a sinking line, and then I put a little bit of red spot for those gills, and so that just adds a little bit more realism to it. You don't have to do that. You can also do that with a black. And then we're going to grab our eyes here, and these are oversized, I would say, for this. You could go smaller, but I usually like to go a step up on the eyes, just personal preference, but that's up to the tire and what works for you. Sometimes smaller is better, but I think the eyes are what really grab a lot of attention along with that flash. And so I'll just check how that looks in your vise. Just position them on each side, and we flatten the thread, so that helps. I'm going to get my UV light already on. That's a really good tip right there when you're going to be, but I push it down on the table so we're not going to be curing our resin in the tip. And then I just put a little bit right there in that gap. I want to feel this gap first. And you could use a thicker resin to do this part. That way it's a little bit more flexible, but I'm just using one resin for the whole thing. And then I'll go ahead and do the underside. This thin runs a little bit, so you got to be really careful as you're working with this. You don't want globs, and the trick to that is one, having a rotating vise or the ability to spin this. You could also epoxy these and putting in a tying wheel, but the resin is something I can just do right now and it's good to go. And so I'll start here on the bottom. I'll lay a nice even bead, and then I'm rotating it slowly, and I'm basically putting a bead of resin on each, I don't know what you'd say, on the bottom, on the top, on the side, and then I just diagonal it across the sides. You can see how right there we're getting a little bit of a goop on the eye. That's a little bit heavy, and so we want to make sure you have your bodkin handy, and also that you're doing this over a surface that you don't mind getting a little bit of resin on, because we don't want to waste that material. And so I'll just grab my bodkin now, and I'm kind of pushing that resin into that mylar, which is then going into and bonding with that bucktail, which is bonding with our thread, and hopefully soaking down to the core and making this just a durable resin fly. So that's a little trick there, and I just spread it from the head backwards because I didn't put it as heavy towards the tail, so I've got room to work with. And then I just inspect it for any sort of imperfections. If you've got a little bubble somewhere, I don't think it really matters, and this is something that you can get better with over time and practice. However, if you do have a huge blob on one of the sides, that could affect the way it swims. I don't have any data to back that up. It's just a theory I have as I'm tying these and thinking about, you know, putting a feather or something on one side of the fly, how it causes drag and causes it to jerk one way or the other. I mean, that seems logical to me, but I'm doing 2 coats just to make sure I've got a nice even tube here. I mean, I want this to be just almost like a plastic tube looking fly, because it's going to be nice and slender and it's going to fish really well. We've got the flash, it's bonded with the UV resin. We've got a hot spot pink on the front. We've got the big eyes, and that is just ready to go. This is going to slay it, and it's on a saltwater hook, really durable. Just make sure you know, I tend to wash my flies after fishing salt, so there we go. You can see how that tapers in real nice. The body tubing tapers into that flashaboo. This is white with a yellow bucktail. I've done white and green, white and blue. I've also experimented with a few two-tones, like, you know, doing pink and yellow, etc., etc. But you can see it's a really fun, simple pattern. It catches fish. It's one of Bob's patterns, and it's called the Surf Candy. So tie some up in your favorite colors, and hopefully they catch some fish.